If every person in your organization cannot tie the values that you espouse to have to the job that they are doing, if they do not understand what those values look like in action, those are not your values. Doesn't make a difference what you say they are. They're not your values.
Welcome to episode 12 of the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence podcast/show. I'm your host, Brittney-Nichole. Today we'll be talking with Céline Williams. Céline is the founder of reVisionary and is a culture engineer, business strategist, and speaker who helps entrepreneurs and conscious companies build strong and wildly successful businesses in a conscious, intentional, and human-focused way. I am beyond excited for you to hear this amazing and powerful interview with Céline. Céline knows what she's talking about, obviously, or she wouldn't be on the show, but we really dive in to the importance of emotional intelligence and self-awareness when we talk about company culture. And what is company culture? And how does it impact the way that we design and build our mission, vision, and values? So without further ado, here is Céline Williams. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. Well, Céline, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you on the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence show/podcast. I really enjoyed the brief conversation that we had as I was sitting in my car getting ready to go into the dentist office.
Yes.
A while back. And I was like, oh my gosh, Céline's awesome. We have so much in common, especially with what we do with our businesses. So I was super excited to have this opportunity to kind of dive a little bit deeper and nerd out with you on emotional intelligence and bringing that into the organization and how you see emotional intelligence impacting organizations and how it has to do with culture and leadership and all of that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So would you mind go ahead and just starting off with telling the audience in your own words a little bit about who Céline is and where you're from?
I would love to. So first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really happy to be here. I love talking about emotional intelligence. I am definitely here for all the nerding out that we're going to do because it's totally up my alley. I am based in Toronto, Canada. So that is, I don't do all my work here, and I'm from Canada, but I've lived a few different places in my life, but I am based here currently. And so I'm going to weave emotional intelligence a little bit into my story. So I actually got exposed to the idea of emotional intelligence probably almost 15 years ago when I was working in corporate. And when I worked in corporate, so I went into the corporate field on, I always joke it was the longest 3-month contract in the history of time because I literally took a 3-month contract that lasted 11 years. So it's definitely outlived that 3 months. But I went in, because I hadn't worked in an office before, truthfully. I had run my own company. I started my own business. I worked for a tutoring company. I'd done a few random things, but I worked for a tutoring company, saw a great opportunity because while minimum wage for most jobs was like $7 an hour, as a tutor, I was making $25 to $35 an hour, and the tutoring company was charging $50 to $75 an hour.
Wow.
So I was like,
that's a profit.
Right. And I was like, why aren't I just running my own tutoring company? I'm doing, they're booking the students, but I was doing the quote execution of the work, right? So that was my first business. I did that. And because of that, I hadn't worked in an office. And in my, after university, a couple years after university, I had a friend, summer, kids don't really like going to school in the summer. So summer was a nice downtime. And so I stepped into work in an office for 3 months to cover summertime. And it lasted 11 years. And I started in an HR capacity, sort of doing HR administration type things, and moved through very people-focused minus project management, world's worst project manager right here. Other than that, I did things like change management and stakeholder engagement and communications. And in doing those pieces, there was an opportunity to do some emotional intelligence training because it was kind of a buzzy word at the time. It was long enough ago that it was not a new concept, but businesses were just starting to talk about it a little bit.
What year was this?
Oh, this was over 10 years ago, so probably 12 or 15 years ago now.
Okay.
So I did the training and I thought, this is cool. I like these ideas. And it wasn't super practical. Like, it was very theoretical, conceptual ideas. But it kind of stuck with me. And years later, when I started doing coach training and doing all these other things, because part of what I do now is executive coaching, it became really relevant. I could really see the application of those ideas that I was interested in. And I'd read a lot more about emotional intelligence after that, just kind of slowly over the years, because I thought it was a cool idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, this makes sense. But I wasn't seeing a lot of, and this is not to say it's not out there, by the way. This is just the nature of where I was looking and what I was seeing. There wasn't a lot of really practical applications. It was, here's what emotional intelligence is, and here's what happens when you apply it. Not, how do I make this work for me?
Yeah.
And
things sound good in theory, but they're not very practical.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in it. When I did my coach training, I could see some of the exercises, even though they weren't talking about emotional intelligence specifically, were super applicable to whether it's recognizing your own emotions, managing emotions. It was very applicable to the concept. And so when I left the corporate space and I started my own company, and so what I do now, and this ties back into the emotional intelligence, is I do executive coaching and I do team coaching for executive teams mainly, but not exclusively. And I do a lot of work in culture design. So what do you want your organizational culture to look like? And emotional intelligence is a thread in almost every conversation with almost every person I talk to now, because I've been also training and doing workshops on emotional intelligence with practical applications and exercises for the past 5 years. It gets woven into a lot of the work, because our success, and full disclosure, this is 100% my bias, I believe our success is dependent on our ability to communicate with other people.
Yes.
All things being equal, you can learn to be a better programmer. You can learn to be a better finance person. You can learn to do all these things. You can also learn to be a better communicator, but your ability to be the best programmer is actually dependent on your ability to be a good communicator. Mm-hmm. Because there's another programmer who is as good as you are out there. But the edge that you give yourself is, how do you connect with and communicate with other people? And emotional intelligence is a brilliant foundation for for your ability to communicate and for your ability to step into that area. So it really is something that is foundational inside of everything I talk about. And a lot of the language that I use comes back to what I have learned about and put into practice around emotional intelligence over the years. And what I've seen, the most successful leaders I have seen, hands down, 100% to this day, the key element in their success is beyond self-awareness into self-insight.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we talk about self-awareness and emotional intelligence a lot.
Right. And
it's, an understanding of what drives us, an understanding of how we show up, what we're feeling, the ability to recognize what we're feeling and thinking, and the stories we're telling ourselves and our patterns. All of that is self-awareness. And that's really important. Self-insight, to me, is the next level of that. So it's when you can take that information and reflect it back into yourself to see the bigger story, to see the bigger pattern, to turn it into actionable information, into vulnerability that you use to improve and get better, not just be like, oh, I was feeling a thing, which is what a lot of people who claim to be self-aware do. They say, yeah, that's I know that about me. That's true.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah.
And what's the next step of that?
Yeah. I love that, because another thing I always tell people is, behind every emotion, especially unpleasant emotions, there's an unmet need. Because emotions are data. And so, like you said, instead of simply labeling that emotion for what it is, asking ourselves, well, where did this come from? Why is this emotion presenting itself now? Because sometimes we may be outraged and we say, well, this is the reason that I'm outraged. But really, if we look a little bit deeper, it was all these other things that slowly built up. And then finally, we blew the top, right? And that one thing was the straw that broke the camel's back. So it's not necessarily that one thing that caused someone to have that feeling or that emotion, but it could be multiple things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you often see people addressing the symptoms of the problem instead of the root cause. So how do you help individuals, especially in organizations and leadership that tend to have, let's say, type A personalities? How do you help them uncover that root cause instead of just simply placing blame or addressing the symptoms?
So I do have the privilege of working with leaders and organizations that are very people focused. They talk about emotional intelligence. They talk about vulnerability. That is part of the reason that I work with them, is that they are already interested in doing the work. Now, that doesn't mean that they get past the symptom to the root cause any more easily than other people. It does usually mean that they're willing to be in the conversation faster. I think the most self-insightful people, I think the people who have done the most work are often also have some of the biggest blind spots when it comes to getting into the root problem of things, because we think we know the answer, because we've seen past the first 3 layers of the symptoms. Right. So we're like, we already know what it is. So part of it, and this is like a really basic old technique, it's the 5 whys. Most of us don't actually go past 1 or 2, let alone 3. But if you can get into the 5 whys, you'll often get into a new level and a new depth of insight into what's really going on and what's causing it. Another technique that I use with people when we're having these conversations of people get stuck in the, I've labeled this thing, I don't necessarily want to do any more of, or I don't know how much further I want to go into the work, how much I want to delve into the world of whatever the root cause of this problem might be, is I bring the conversation back to what is your intention inside of this? What are you ultimately looking to accomplish? What is the impact you want to have? What does that look like? Because if getting into the root problem is going to help you with whatever that vision or who you want to be in the world or the impact you want to have in the world, if it's going to help you move towards that, then we need to have this conversation.
Right.
And if that is not that important to you, or there's no obvious link, and that's rare, then that's fine. If you want to stay in the symptom, that's fine. It's not always the right time to dig into what those root causes are. Sometimes the awareness that there's something more is enough for now.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And
for anyone,
go ahead.
You brought up the 5 whys. Mm-hmm. So for anyone watching or listening that's like, what's the 5 whys? Can you explain what are those 5 whys?
So it's as easy as it sounds. It is asking why 5 times. And most of us don't do this. And it sounds absurd. I will explain this in more depth, and it's going to sound absurd, and you'll try it and you'll be like, oh, that's why people don't do it, because it feels uncomfortable to go that deep. So it is, I'm feeling really angry that I got this feedback from my boss. Well, why are you feeling that way? Because it makes me feel like I didn't do a good enough job. Why do you think that? Because every time I don't do a good job, this happens. Why is that? Now I have lost the ability to go deeper because it's not a real situation. But in a real situation, there's always 5 whys to get deeper and deeper. And it is literally taking what the person says and asking the why question associated with it.
So it's like being a 3-year-old.
It's like being a 3-year-old. 5 times.
Why?
5 times. That's right. Now, the key is not to just say why, because why can feel like a very aggressive question, right? Like if someone says, I'm really angry about something, you go, well, why? People can get very defensive very quickly if you just ask why. It's the reason that when you go through coach training, they try and reframe all questions as what and how questions, so that people don't get defensive with why questions, because why can feel judgmental. And it can. And it's still the most powerful question to get to a root cause of something is a why question, because you can talk around things with a what question, and you can talk around things with a how question. How did you get there? How is it happening? How does that work? What is the reason we say, what is the reason you think that is a coaching question, so you're not saying why. It's the same question. What makes you think that? What happened that blah, blah, blah.
Instead of why did that happen?
Right.
Or why did you think that? Yeah.
Right. But you can talk around when it's a what question. It's much harder because why is so direct. And when you ask 5 direct why questions in a row, it's almost impossible to avoid the real source of something at that point in time. Because you can talk around it the first 2 or 3 times, and people often will. They often will. They'll tell you the surface things because that's the first thing that comes up. And that's the first thing that comes up. And then by the 4th and 5th, they're not able to do that anymore. A really great why question that I ask a lot, and I recommend for everyone, even to do self-analysis, if you're thinking of it for yourself, why is that important to me?
Yeah.
It's that combination of value and why in a really simple question. And it is a hard question to not be insightful about when you think about it for yourself, or someone asks you that question. Why is that important to you?
It's interesting you bring that up, because I have coaching clients who are very successful, financially successful, run a great business. And they talk about the next big thing and the next big thing. And I want to get this, and I want to do that, and I want to have this. And said, okay, so what about that, excites you? They're like, I don't know. Sometimes I think maybe I don't want it. I don't know if I want it or not. And how do you get them? I try to separate what is expected of you from your peers, that pressure. You feel like you have to have that nice house, or you have to have that, $200,000 plus car, because that's what the people around you that are quote unquote successful have. But are you doing it for them, or are you doing it for yourself? Because they kind of talk out of both sides of their mouth. They talk about the burden of having that thing, what that means, and that they really don't care. But then the next minute they're talking about how they want that and need that. So how do you help people see what they truly want and separate that from what maybe they feel like they need to have to be accepted? Whether that's by their C-suite or their stakeholders, since we're talking about organizations, how do you get them to see what they truly want?
That's a hard question, because many people have not looked at or faced the reality of how much of what they think they want is actually the things that society tells them they should want, or that they have taken on as part of, the social contract that we all make as humans living in societies. And I do work inside of a program that I call Deconstructing Our Constructs to identify that. And it is first and foremost the identification of what those constructs are that we are aware of, the ones that we might not be aware of, but that I or someone else inside of a program has pointed out. We're like, oh, wow, I hadn't even thought that was real, but I can totally see that. And this goes, and by the way, this is also how we break down biases, right? Like, this is how we break down biases, is by recognizing I call them social constructs, call them whatever you want, but we all take them on and they exist. The first step is to recognize and name them for what they are, full stop. If you can't name them, if you don't see them as a construct, you can never separate what you want from what you've been taught to want.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the big difference. Once you've named and identified what those constructs are, then, and my lens that I like to talk about is values. So if you know what your values are, not what your aspirational values are, I don't care what anyone's aspirational values are, the actual values that you make decisions from and live inside of every single day. If you know what those values are and they are in action and you know that they are your true values, when you run those list of construct or those things that you think you want through your values table, call it, core values list, whatever you want to call it, and that list of constructs to see if they are yours or something you've taken on, it becomes much easier to separate out what is really driving you and is in line with who you are aspiring to be, stepping into the best version of yourself, or if it's something that lines up with what you think something is supposed to look like, or you think life is supposed to be like. But it's a great question, and it's just I don't think it's as easy as separating them. I really think it is a longer piece of work to get through that, because otherwise we have, however old we are, we have that many years of filtering and conditioning around what we think things are supposed to look like that we're dealing with.
Exactly. And I love that you kind of went this direction with this conversation, because the next thing that I want to talk about, and it goes so well with like what your true vision and values are, is culture in organizations.
Yeah.
Because I know you have spoken several things I've watched. You talk about culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that so many organizations see the culture of places like Google and, these Silicon Valley, like, let's have a beer garden and let's have, an arcade and all these things to make work fun, and let's wear jeans every day and a t-shirt. We don't care what you wear, right? To kind of draw people in. But then if you don't embody something deeper than that, you're going to lose people. And I see that all the time with startups that kind of have this little lure, in a sense. They're dangling out in front of you like, you want to come work for us. Look at all this great stuff we have. And then once you get in there, this people-centered culture is really like very drive, like metrics. We've got to crank this out. And then all those shiny things just disappear.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you talk to people about ensuring that their true values and mission reflects in their culture?
So first and foremost, culture is never the trappings of culture that you're talking about. And the first thing I do is make sure that everyone knows that. It doesn't matter if you have 80 ping pong tables in your games room and a private chef that comes every single day to make lunch for all your programmers, and you have your mission statement on the wall when you walk into the building, and then your values listed as you walk down the hall. None of that matters. Those are the trappings of culture. That is what startups, and I'm picking on startups in this case because it's startups who tend to do that because they're trying to attract and retain tech talent specifically. Right. But it's what they do so it looks like that these are the incentives that will keep people there. And we know from what motivates people and from what the research tells us is those are not the things that keep people there. That's not actually what motivates people. But it's really easy to see that stuff. And because we can see it, we get hung up on it as that is what culture is. So the first thing I do is make it really, really clear that that is not, in fact, what culture is. A couple of the things that I do is if I'm working with an organization or with leaders that have a set of values, is we do a real true values check on what those are to see if they are aspirational or real. If every person in your organization cannot tie the values that you espouse to have to the job that they are doing, if they do not understand what those values look like in action, those are not your values. Doesn't make a difference what you say they are. They're not your values. Your values can be communication, transparency, and effectiveness. if every person in your organization cannot say, yeah, this is a very transparent organization, I feel I know as much information as I can know from the CEO down to whoever, then transparency is not your real value. It might be something else, but everyone has to be able to understand it in the context of the work that they are doing, not just as an idea that exists. So that's first and foremost. The second thing is that, call it mission, vision, whatever you want to call it. I often refer to it just as purpose, in the sense that very few people in organizations are ever going to be able to say to you, I know that my company's mission is blah, 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 whatever the language is. But if they understand the purpose of the company, and again, the real key is that they can tie the work they're doing directly to that purpose in some way. So if the purpose of my organization is to empower leaders to have better conversations, that's the purpose of my organization, then anyone who works with me inside my organization should be able to understand how their job and the work that they do ties to that purpose, whatever it is. So my assistant might be able to say, well, I free up Celine's time so that she can help those leaders so she's directly responsible for me being able to impact those people. So she knows how the work that she is doing is tied to the purpose of empowering leaders to have more effective conversations. The coaches that I have working for me, they can see that all of the work that they're doing is impacting other people on the team that is allowing those people to have more effective conversations. So they can tie all of it. And, the web designer that I'm working with, they can see that by having a nicer website than I currently have and having, better stories on the website, that then it allows me to work with more leaders, that, et cetera, right? So it all ties to how can I see what I'm doing as part of the purpose, which is why the specific vision, mission, language, I get it's important. I'm less tied to it than I am to how are people tying themselves to the purpose that this organization, big or small, is moving towards, right?
Yeah.
And so that's often the starting point. And I will say that small or large, the organizations I work with, we do a lot of work specifically when it comes to culture around one of the companies I'm working with right now, we're calling them tenets. What are the tenets that are behind the culture of this organization? How do we show up? How do we work with each other? How do we interact? What are the rules of engagement for the organization as a whole? And we created a high-level list of what those rules of engagement were, what the tenets were. And now we are literally doing all of the work to put them into action, to put them into examples, to put them into conversation documents so that people can now use them in their work day to day. Because many people are, but there's still variety inside of it. So we are giving them a structure. So I talk about culture like a sandbox. I'm building a sandbox. Everywhere I go, this is the frame of the outline of the sandbox is what I was going to say. The frame of the sandbox. I'm attaching the wood, building the frame of the sandbox. Here's the rules. This is what it looks like. Now I'm going to throw a whole bunch of sand inside of it, and you get to go in and play however you want. You want to build a sand castle in the corner? That's fine. You know where the edges of the sandbox are. You want to go and pour some water and dig around in this corner? That's fine, because you know where the edges of the sandbox are. When we know what the edges of the sandbox are, we can all play effectively together so that we are building whatever in the confines of what that looks like. Culture is the sandbox. So we create these documents, we create these frameworks, and then we give people tools to actually use them and know how to play together.
Wow. I love that analogy, because the next thing I was about to say, it's like you're reading my mind here. The next thing I was going to say is, in organizations where, in a startup of anywhere from 5 to 50 people, it's small enough that you're interacting with everyone, right? Yeah. And you could probably even go to the hundreds and still feel like you're close enough with everyone that you know what's going on. But when you get into larger organizations, or even Fortune 500s, I used to work for a Fortune 500. And some people loved the organization, some people hated the organization. And it all had to do with the department they were in, the manager that they had, even though that like they had a sandbox, if you will, of these are our rules. But it's like, instead of a sandbox, you're on the beach, and you can't necessarily see those rules all the time because you have to really search for them. Right? So how do you advise people who are in organizations that are so large and very siloed, that seem to have their own sandboxes within the sandbox, if you will?
It does. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. So first and foremost, let's stop having silos in organizations. Let's just stop that. That is a very old way of working. It doesn't work well anymore. Things move too fast now. I don't care how big an organization is. There's no excuse for it anymore. That needs to change. I have very specific thoughts on things like this, because those, it just doesn't work that way anymore. We cannot react. Organizations of any size, the larger even more so than the smaller, cannot react and respond fast enough when they are siloed. There is no excuse for it. If you have a siloed organization, you need to look at your leadership team and figure out where that is coming from, and that needs to change. And that means different conversations, and that means a whole different layer of vulnerability and transparency than is probably happening. So first and foremost, let's stop that. But there is a reality that the larger an organization gets, the more we get subcultures on teams. And that it doesn't even necessarily have to be because it's siloed. It's just because these are the people that you're working with on a regular basis. A lot of the understanding of the rules of a culture, if you will, a lot of the understanding of what that looks like has to come from the leadership team. They have to be bought into it. They have to be living it. They have to be encouraging it. They have to be having the conversations that reinforce what this is, not letting things slide, because it's easier to let things go than to have a difficult conversation, because that is what creates the silos. That is what creates the subcultures that are then unhealthy and impossible to know where you stand inside of.
Yeah. And with generational differences. So how do you address that? Because the younger generations, like my generation, the millennials, we're comfortable directly calling the CEO. We don't care. It's like, you're just a human being who's had X number of years of experience, right? Like, you're a person. I should be able to talk to you. I should be able to know what's going on. But then you have your baby boomers who are like, no, there is a hierarchy. There are rules to this. So how do you get them how do you use emotional intelligence as well in that to get them to work together effectively?
It depends on the organization, and it depends on the appetite that they have to embrace different ways of doing things. It's a really unsatisfactory answer, but it does depend on that. One of the organizations I work with, they know they're my favorite organization, so I can say this because if they're listening, they know who they are. They have a team that is, a lot of their senior executives are Gen X. There's a couple of millennials on their senior executive team, and there's a couple of baby boomers on their senior executive team. And all of the work that we do is around vulnerability and transparency, and how do you connect and open up, and how do you share real stories and really truly show up. We talk about, they'll use the language of, I will get calls, and they'll use the language of, I am feeling really hijacked right now, and I need to talk this through so I can go in and have a better conversation. They will, this is the story I'm making up based on what that person said to me. They'll use language like that, and they're not all, most of them are 40 and above. So right. Gen X and into baby boomers, it's like 40 to 60 something. But they are truly a people-focused organization and culture. And they know that in order for people to feel safe, they have to feel understood, they have to feel heard, they have to feel like they have a voice. You cannot feel those things if you don't feel like you can speak up and connect with people. You don't feel that things. You can't have a culture of psychological safety if you feel like there is a distance and a barrier between you and someone else in the organization. And so the challenge is really those people that want the hierarchy, they don't want psychological safety, and they don't want a culture that's really about the people. They want a culture that is about just do what I want, just do what I tell you to do, and that's it. That's what hierarchy is. So the challenge is really everyone on that. It's not just one person who can change that. People have to be willing to change that. If they are willing to engage in that conversation, if they recognize, and I've worked with organizations where it was, 55 to 70 plus year old executives sitting at the table who don't understand these millennials who are reaching out to them, and they don't know what to do about them, and they just want to work all these flexible hours, and what are they, you just come in, that was the attitude.
Yeah.
And they recognized that was not going to change. So them imposing their rules wasn't changing what was happening. They just had ridiculous turnover rate. The retention was terrible.
Yeah.
So what we did was they said they wanted to change something. They didn't know where to start. So we started with a reverse mentoring program. So they were paired with a younger person, millennial, let's call them, right? A 60-year-old executive with someone in the organization, mid-level or lower, who was 28, and they were paired for reverse mentoring conversations. So yeah, the 28-year-old or 30-year-old could come and ask this senior executive questions. However, that was not the purpose of it. The purpose of it was for the older person to actually learn and understand why these things matter to that 28-year-old, why they want that flexibility, why it's important to them. And by doing that and actually creating some understanding, they changed how they perceived the behaviors of that generation. So it starts to affect change in bigger ways, but it's not just as simple as, it's not as simple as just let's open up a conversation. There are steps to be taken depending on the appetite, and it has to start with a recognition that you want something different, or that there is a problem that is specifically in this area.
And I love that and I hate to use the word forced, but what it's doing is it's fostering that exposure.
Yes.
And when you get to know someone, it's very hard to dislike them. I believe it was Abraham Lincoln who said, "I do not like that man, therefore I must get to know him." Mm-hmm. Because when you get to know people, you strip away all the generalizations that go with that person, and get to know them at an individual level. It's really hard to dislike people because everybody has something of value to bring to the table. Even if it's something that's very small in your eyes, but everybody has value. And
absolutely.
With understanding emotional intelligence, and this, there's not bad people, there's negative behaviors.
Yes.
And when we're able to detach those behaviors in the individual, that way we can focus on the person instead of their behaviors. They're not a bad person. Their behaviors are not necessarily productive or always the best approach to a situation, right? But we need to see that person has a need that potentially isn't being met. There's a reason why they're behaving in that way. And that's the beauty of emotional intelligence, in my opinion.
I totally agree with you. And it's one of the reasons that I use that example is because the senior people that are involved in those conversations are forced, but they are encouraged to step out of their comfort zone and to have a real conversation and to lean into the whole piece of emotional intelligence that is, understanding other people's emotions, understanding other people's, managing other people's reactions, that sort of thing. They're very much encouraged to step into that because they're stepping into a place that they're not comfortable with. but they are also forced to self-reflect inside of that, because they are going to hear through hopefully the empathy they are practicing, right? That piece of emotional intelligence, by practicing empathy, they're also reflecting on their own needs and why the things that matter to them that they're trying to encourage and enforce, the structure, whatever it is, why that's so important. So the process of emotional intelligence, those 4 key steps that we often talk about, they are vital to these conversations being productive. They are vital to the understanding that is created both between the younger generation and the older generation, in order to find whatever the middle ground that works for everyone looks like, in order to foster the encouragement of understanding, so that if that person wants to work from home 2 days a week, okay, if they're in the office, whatever I'm blanking on the word, whatever the middle ground looks like, whatever the solution looks like, whatever the conversation turns into, emotional intelligence and that structure enables that to happen, so that it's not 2 people or 2 groups or 8 groups just continuing to butt heads and refusing to see eye to eye.
Right. So there's one thing I talk about, especially when it comes to perspective and reality, right? We tend to like to polarize things. This is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, when the majority of things is just based on your perspective. What's good for one person isn't necessarily good for another person. And I think of a man in a desert, and all he can see is sand. So he says, well, the world is a vast wasteland. And then another person's on a boat in the middle of the ocean, and he's like, no, it's just vast blue water. And so instead of taking a step back and seeing the big picture, they just argue about who's right and who's wrong, but they're both right in their own perspective, right? And I think that's what you're getting at, is that instead of arguing over it, coming from a place of that understanding and realizing that we can work together, and that saying 2 heads are better than 1, right? But I think that key piece of understanding, and like you were saying in the very beginning, communication. You have to have that effective communication.
Yeah, so I want to build on something you said there, because one of the most toxic things that we hear in business and in leadership is this idea of building consensus, of having everyone come to an agreement. And that is a terrible waste of time. I'm going to call it what it is. It's a terrible waste. Collaboration to come to an agreement is a waste of time. Now, listening to other people's opinions, understanding their perspective, recognizing that there's no such thing as right or wrong. There is just many different ways to do something. Some are going to have better results than others. That's all it is. Everything is gray. So when we focus on trying to find the best solution, and we step out of let's collaborate until we find consensus, we are much more effective at whatever problem we're trying to solve. We're much more effective at finding the best solution to that problem. And unfortunately, because we come from a society, and this is one of those, societal constructs that are out there that tells us that there's such a thing as right or wrong, we then default into black and white thinking.
Yep.
And when we default into black and white thinking, we have to collaborate to come to one answer together, because there can only be one answer, because there is a right answer that we are trying to find.
Right.
It's a lot of time that is better spent doing something else, understanding the other perspectives, recognizing what the blind spots might be, gathering better information. There's a lot more things we can do that will get us better solutions.
Agreed. This hour went by very quickly, by the way.
It did.
And I know we had some small talk in the beginning, but I want to end with, I love the name of your company, reVisionary.
Thank you. reVisionary, yes.
So can you explain, like, how did you come up with that, and what does that mean to you, and what are the values that you hold within your organization and the purpose of your organization?
So the name reVisionary, so the full story is that I was really struggling to come up with a name for my company a number of years ago. And I was working with a friend of mine who's a writer to write some copy, hoping that that would get me to the point of inspiration. And that word was inside something that he had written. And I immediately was like, that's the name of my company. Because so there's two reasons. One is the visual impact of the word visionary with re in front of it. So there's a visual impact, and there's a, if you don't look at the formal definition of the word, what people interpret and see is the idea of being a visionary again. So that is very important and a big piece of it. But also, revisionary is like revisionist history is when you're rewriting something, when you're going back and redoing something. And I firmly believe that we are all, what the work that we are doing, whatever it is, it's not just us doing it on our own. We are taking other pieces of work and ideas and combining them and mixing them and revising them. Yep. We are constantly revising what's already out there. And so that was such an important concept to me, and it has been for so long, that being a revisionary just made a ton of sense based on the meaning of the actual meaning of the word. So I appreciate that, because it was hard earned to get to the name of that company. I love
hearing the backstory. That's awesome. That's so powerful too.
Well, thank you. So as to sort of what the purpose, is that what you asked? What my purpose of so despite the fact that I do this work with organizations all the time, I'm really bad at actually doing it for my own company, full disclosure. But I would say the main purpose of the work that I do consistently is to enable people to show up as the best version of themselves inside of the work that they're doing and the spaces that they're playing in, so that they can then enable that in other people as well. And that best version can be different day to day. And that best version is not something that I am dictating or that someone else is dictating. That best version gets to flow and change and ebb, because we are all human beings who are constantly changing and growing. But I have seen in my past too many leaders who were not encouraging that, because they weren't feeling it, because they had to be a certain way, because that's what had been dictated to them, because that's what they'd taken on. And so I am all about helping leaders figure out what that looks like for them and lean into that and be safe inside of that, and creating cultures that enable that, so that that happens for other people. Because the more we can be ourselves and be that best version of ourselves on a daily basis, the better work we get to do, the better we feel every day, the more engaged we are. It ripples everywhere in our life.
It does. Very well said. Very well said. Not to have that prepared. Good job.
Thank you.
Céline, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. I'm so glad that we could have this conversation. And I honestly think we could even do like a second round in the future, because I really enjoyed this. And I think we just kind of hit just a little bit of the iceberg, and there's a lot more to uncover. So
I'd be happy to. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome. And where can people find more information about you?
So they can go to my website. It's revisionary.ca. And they can, I'm on social media under that as well. And you can always email me directly if you have any questions, just Céline@revisionary.ca. I'm happy to connect with people. And LinkedIn. I always forget about LinkedIn. I'm also there.
And I will put all of that information in the show notes, so that way people don't have to remember anything. They can just find it there as well. So
perfect.
Be sure to put that there.
Thank you.
Thank you.